Here's a little update on Frankinquad, the 212 Predator ATV. I'm still using the Kimco transmission that came with it, but my issue is the sprocket I had on here, it was reducing my gearing too much, and I decided I want to speed it up quite a bit. So I added a torque converter and took off the old clutch, and it took a little bit to get the torque converter to fit. I had to move the engine forward, and I'm still running the number 35 chain sprocket here, and I've got a 5/8 12 tooth here, and I'm going to put a 5/8 12 tooth here. Now the problem is I've already chiseled the old sprocket that I had welded on there. I already chiseled it off and cut it with an angle grinder, but my issue is this. I've got to either cut this shaft off way up here and weld a 5/8 shaft bolt to it and try to get it centered, or I could try to turn this shaft down. Now I really don't want to feel like, don't feel like tearing this whole thing apart and taking it to a machine shop and having that centered and brought down. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to weld a bolt, just tack weld it to the end of this shaft, because as you can see, that shaft is sticking out enough to where I could turn this shaft here down to back here and slide that sprocket on there and key it in and then weld it, and I should be all set. Anyway, I'm going to weld a bolt here, and then I'm going to use my cordless drill and put a zip tie on the trigger of my cordless drill and run it slow, and then take my angle grinder with a 40 grit flap wheel and just start working this shaft slowly until I turn it down to 5/8. And I've got a 5/8 inch open end wrench here, so I don't have to take and shut this whole thing down and measure it and all that. I'm just gonna hit it with that flap wheel for a little bit and then touch the wrench to it, and once that wrench starts to slide on there, then I know it's all set. So let's get to it. So here we go. I've got the bolt tacked on there, the zip tie on the cordless drill, and the shaft is slowly turning. I'm going to speed it up just a little bit more and then get after that with my 40 grit flap wheel on my grinder and turn that thing down. So we'll show you the results. So good, it's turning on down. Now the wiggle is how I got the bolt welded on there. It's not the shaft itself. The shaft is actually spinning pretty darn straight. Okay, I got the shaft turned down. Just had my drill on low speed with a zip tie holding the trigger, and I went and set the clutch on like 6 on my drill, which it goes up to 12. That way, if I was running that wrench on here, if anything bound up, the clutch would kick out on the drill and it wouldn't destroy anything. Anyway, I got this down to 5/8 by checking it with an open end 5/8 wrench, so I didn't have to stop and use a micrometer the whole time. And as you can see, the shaft is straight again. It's turning straight. And I beveled the end of this shaft with my flap wheel so that I can get a nice bead of weld up inside of this gear in the shaft. And after that, all I'll need to do is to tighten up the Allen lock bolt in the groove that I cut back there, and we'll be all set to put the chain back on. Okay, I got it welded on there. I went and ground down my welds just a little bit to make sure that I had good penetration, didn't have any holes, which I've got good penetration, and I've got the lock or the set screw on that gear tightened up. So I'm just going to let it cool down for a little while, and then we're going to throw the chain on it. It's dark outside right now, so I can't test it. But I'm sure it's going to be a hell of a lot quicker than it was, because I had a 10 up front and a 22 back there, which, like I said, it slowed the gear ratio down quite a bit. And now it's 10 to 10, 10 tooth, 10 tooth. And then I've got a 18 on the other side, and that 18 goes to a 30. So it ought to be pretty quick when I'm done. Hopefully, and hopefully it doesn't explode. We'll find out. Gear on there, chains on, everything seems to be working fine. I've got a couple of stiff spots in my chain that I've got to oil up and work out, but other than that, I think we're about done other than the exhaust. I got to cut me a piece to put in here and tie that together. I've got to bend this out some and then do an exhaust wrap on that. And I might have a couple of other little things to button up. I'd like to find the original cover that went over this and bolt it here and then pie cut it so that this back here is covered, and then I'm going to put the cover on the torque converter. But if I can't find this cover back here, it's not that big of a deal. It's just for aesthetics, and eventually I could build a cover to fit that. Anyway, it's 10 o'clock now. I think I'm about ready for a shower and a beer. I blew my carburetor gasket on my aftermarket carburetor that I've got on my 212 Predator Kimco ATV conversion here. And I figured I'd show you my setup while I tear the carburetor off and do a new carburetor gasket. This originally had an O-ring in there, and as you can see, I had to widen the holes a little bit so that it would fit the Predator setup. And this is a Keihin carburetor. It's a PZ30. You can get them on Amazon. They're about 12 bucks. Anyway, you do have to modify the mount in order for it to fit. And it's like a 43 millimeter carburetor. And something else I had to do was I took me a piece of flat stock aluminum, just aluminum plate, and I cut a hole in the middle of it with a hole saw and drilled the 2 holes. And then I'm using the original mount, or the original gasket for the Predator carburetor. And if you look, that plate right there mounts right up. It doesn't block off that little jet hole or anything. This carburetor's actually worked really well on this. This part seals really good. But what I did was I blew that little O-ring out. So I've got some gasket maker material that I'm going to make a new gasket out of. And I'm going to use this here as my template to make the new gasket. So what I'm going to do is take the gasket material, push this down on top of it, and mark it with an ink pen. And after I get it marked, I'm just going to take an X-Acto knife and cut it out, and that way I won't have a rubber gasket or a little rubber O-ring in there. I'll have a good gasket material that should seal up really well. But I've had this carburetor on here for over a year now, and it's worked great, never had any issues. Now when you install the carburetor, it doesn't set straight up and down. It sets at an angle. It sets at a slight angle, but I haven't had any issues at all with it flooding out or anything like that. And it's a pretty simple carburetor. It's a really cheap carburetor. And I just used the original throttle and everything that came with the Kimco, but it did come with this setup. I just got lazy and just never changed the plunger or the needle out. I just used the original needle that came with this ATV, and it just dropped right in. But yeah, that was like a $12 carburetor. Amazon Prime was free shipping. Got it the next day, and so far it's worked out really good. And I just put a $2.50 42 millimeter filter on there, and just doing it on with a hose clamp, and it's done great. Other than I was lazy earlier, and I should have just let the bowl fill on its own, but instead I put my hand over the carburetor and tried to prime it. And when I did, I felt immediately whenever I blew that gasket out. But anyway, we're going to fix that, which, I mean, it's always been a weak point in this anyway. You know, it was just kind of a quick throw together thing that lasted a year. And we're going to do the gasket right now. engines, I recommend you getting a roll of this gasket maker material. It's not very expensive, probably $6 to $10 for a roll of this. But if you need a gasket, instead of ordering and waiting a week, you just grab a chunk of this and make you a new gasket. And it's pretty easy to do. So let's get this going. I've already taken my X-Acto hook blade and cut the perimeter here. And this X-Acto hook blade is real nice because you can get up underneath shallow stuff. I've got a bunch of these. Now I found me a drill bit that will fit these two holes, and I'm keeping it clamped. And I'm just going to take my cordless drill and drill those two holes, and then we'll score the inside and cut it out. You can see I got it mostly cut out. I've just got to trim it just a little bit. But that took about 20 seconds to make that. Gasket done. Got it all cleaned up. Another way to do this, if you don't have one of those blades, is to lay your template on top and hit it with some spray paint and let the spray paint dry, and that'll give you a pattern. And then you can use a rotary hole punch. Take your scissors, cut around the outside edge, and then take your rotary hole punch out the middle, and then punch out your two bolt holes with a rotary punch. And what I'm talking about is a rotary leather punch. Works really good at making these gaskets. Alright, I'll be back. I'm going to put this back together. I got my carburetor gasket done. Carburetor's remounted. I've got 2 layers of exhaust wrap on the exhaust. Sprockets hooked back up. Carburetor's rebuilt. I rejetted a little bit. Let's see what it'll do. And bear with me. You know, I'm using one hand to drive and brake and all that. Come on, get in first. There we go. Neutral. Quarter throttle is sketchy. Alright, as you can see, my shifter that goes up to there is gone. I got up to the end of the driveway and I hammered on it and it flipped. I did a wheelie for about 10 feet and it was too much. It flipped the ATV over. Shifter hit me in the leg and it snapped off. So now I've got to figure out a way to put another shifter on this. That's a lot of torque. I'll put a foot shifter on it. Then off the brake. Take it easy, easy. Alright, hold on. throttle, I can't even keep it in the daggum driveway. That is sketchy. Half throttle, I cannot control this thing in my driveway.